Why did the laughter stop the moment the rifle case hit the concrete? And why did she refuse to look up when everyone else froze? The sound echoed longer than it should have. A hollow, cracking thud that swallowed the maintenance bay's noise and spat it back as silence. Eva Rostova stayed kneeling where she was, one hand still resting on the torque wrench, the other steadying the barrel she had been tuning with surgeon-like care. Around her, men waited for a reaction, a flare of anger, a curse, anything that would make this familiar, but she didn't give it to them. She only breathed, slow and controlled, while the smell of solvent and dust hung in the air like a held breath. She had learned, long ago, that some moments demanded restraint more than retaliation. That dignity often sounded like nothing at all. They had laughed because they thought they knew what had broken. A case, a scope, a woman's pride. They had not understood that what lay shattered in foam was years of precision, nights of calculation, a language of physics she spoke fluently when words failed her. She rose slowly, unlatched the case, and documented the damage with quiet thoroughness. Each photograph was a sentence in a story she refused to tell aloud yet. The cracked optic, the bent mount, the men in the background suddenly uneasy. She said nothing because nothing she said would matter to them. Not yet. Inside her container later, with the door shut and the world reduced to humming servers and clean light, the weight finally settled. Not anger, something heavier. Disappointment. The kind that presses on the chest when competence is mistaken for weakness. She laid out the broken components and felt the old ache rise of being unseen, of being tolerated only until proven necessary. She had been here before. Different base. Different men. Same silence. She inhaled, steadied her hands, and began the work. Piece by piece, she restored order, not just to the optic but to herself. New text document. What kind of person fixes what was deliberately broken instead of reporting the hand that broke it? By morning, her fingers were sore and her eyes burned from magnification, but the system was alive again. Not replaced, rebuilt, stronger where it mattered. She had machined parts for this contingency years earlier, never expecting to need them this way. As she tightened the final screws, she felt the familiar calm return. This was where she belonged, inside problems, not arguments. Solutions didn't raise their voices. They clicked into place. When the order came to stop, it landed harder than the kick that had toppled the case. The captain's voice was sharp with regulation, his certainty borrowed from paper instead of experience. Unauthorized, liability, waste of time, each word cut because it dismissed not just her tool but her judgment. She listened. She nodded. She complied on the surface. Inside, something quiet broke. Not trust, she'd learned better, but hope. The hope that precision might someday outrank procedure. She stood alone after he left, staring at the rifle now whole again. The counseling statement would follow her, a mark. A reminder that systems often punished what they didn't understand. For a moment she considered shelving the weapon, taking the standard issue, shrinking herself to fit the mold. It would be easier. It always was. But easy had never saved anyone. She closed the case and waited. Why would someone walk into a room full of disbelief and say calmly, "I can make that shot"? The Tactical Operations Center felt different when the alarm pulsed red. Urgent. Alive. The enemy had a face now, and he was winning without firing a shot. Eva watched the feed from her container, reading the problem as it unfolded. Distance, terrain, air, data, a fortress built of physics. She didn't feel excitement, only clarity. When she entered the TOC, the room parted without noticing. She spoke to the colonel because he was the one who needed answers, not approval. "I can make that shot." The words weren't brave, they were factual. Laughter followed, dismissal, records quoted like shields. She stood there anyway, feeling the familiar pressure of being the only one seeing a viable path. When the colonel asked her to explain, she did, not with drama but with requirements, atmosphere, waypoints, time. This wasn't a miracle. It was math, patience, and trust in preparation. She felt anxious then, not about the shot but about being believed, about being allowed to try. When permission came, it felt less like victory and more like relief. One chance. That was all she'd ever needed. What does 11 seconds feel like? when your entire life has narrowed to a single arc of air. On the outcrop, the world widened and shrank at the same time. The valley stretched endlessly, yet her focus tunneled through glass and data. The drones fed her the atmosphere in layers. She adjusted, calculated, adjusted again. The men behind her whispered disbelief, but their voices were already fatting. She was somewhere quieter now, somewhere honest. She chambered the round and settled in. Her heart rate slowed. The anxiety she'd felt earlier dissolved into something steadier, determination without ego. She wasn't trying to prove them wrong. She was trying to make the problem stop hurting people she'd never meet. She announced the shot because procedure mattered even now. The rifle spoke once, deep, final. The bullet vanished into 11 seconds of possibility. In the TOC, time stretched thin. On the mountain, dust bloomed where electronics had stood. The jamming died like a severed nerve. It was over. Eva cycled the bolt, caught the casing, and checked it out of habit. Her hands didn't shake. She felt proud, but quietly, privately. Pride wasn't something she displayed. It was something she carried, like a tool kept clean and ready. What happens when the impossible forces a reckoning no one planned for? The formation the next morning was heavy with anticipation. Eva stood straight, eyes forward, feeling the weight of attention settle differently now. The colonel spoke plainly. Facts, accountability, names, the truth laid out in daylight. She felt a flicker of vindication, quickly tempered by something more complex. This wasn't about punishment. It was about correction. Systems learning slowly, painfully. When the salute came, it surprised her. Not because she felt unworthy, but because recognition was rare and public recognition rarer still. She returned it, steady and composed, even as something inside loosened, a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Later, back in her container, the quiet returned. The new optic sat unopened. She chose her own system instead, cleaning it with care. It had done its job. So had she. When Elias left the upgraded part on her bench, she understood the gesture for what it was, respect without spectacle. It mattered more than applause. She typed her final log entry and paused, considering the words. She chose simplicity, precision, truth. Correction was achieved. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Why did she feel more exposed in silence than she ever did under enemy fire? The container door slid shut behind her, sealing out the noise of the base, but it couldn't seal out the weight pressing against her ribs. Eva Rostova stood still for a moment, her back to the door, eyes closed, palms resting lightly on the cold steel workbench. The counseling order replayed in her head, not the words themselves, but the tone, final, certain. As if her years of precision could be erased with a signature, she exhaled slowly. This was the part no one ever saw, not the public humiliation. Not the broken equipment, but the quiet recalibration that followed when doubt crept in wearing the uniform of authority. She opened her eyes and looked at the rifle, whole again, improved even, and yet officially useless. That contradiction gnawed at her. She had learned early in her career that being exceptional didn't protect you. Sometimes it painted a target. She remembered another base years ago when a senior NCO had told her almost kindly, "You make people nervous when you don't need them." She hadn't understood then. She did now. Independence unsettled hierarchies. Silence unsettled egos. She powered up her data pad and ran diagnostics again, not because they were needed, but because repetition grounded her. Numbers didn't care about rank. Physics didn't care about opinions. Wind didn't respond to authority. There was comfort in that. A fragile comfort, but real. Outside, the base went on. Engines started. Orders were barked. Somewhere, Sergeant Miller laughed again, the sound drifting faintly through the metal walls. Eva's jaw tightened just once, not in anger, in resolve. She wasn't angry at him anymore. She was tired of explaining gravity to people who preferred slogans. What keeps someone going when the system they serve quietly tells them they don't belong? The hours crawled. She complied with the order on paper, logged time, attended briefings, stayed visible. But inside she was waiting, Not passively, she listened. Monitored. Threads of data flowed through her station, patterns most people ignored because they didn't scream danger yet. She noticed the subtle degradation in comms, the way latency spiked and fell in irregular rhythms. Someone was testing something, probing. By evening the pattern sharpened, elegant, ruthless. She felt a familiar chill, not fear but recognition. This wasn't random interference. This was deliberate architecture, someone patient, someone brilliant. Oracle. She leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on the scrolling data. The irony tasted bitter. The one threat tailored perfectly to her skill set, and she had been sidelined by procedure. She felt anxious then, a low hum beneath her calm, not for herself, for everyone relying on fragile networks that were quietly being unraveled. She drafted a preliminary analysis and sent it up channel. Clean, professional, no commentary. She knew better than to sound alarmist. Still, she doubted it would change anything. She had learned that warnings from the margins often arrived too softly. Night settled over the base. The mountains beyond the wire dissolved into shadow. Eva stayed. Why do some warnings only matter after the damage becomes visible? The alert came just before midnight. Red lights, voices tightening, the hum of the bass shifting into a higher register of urgency. Eva was already on her feet, pulling on her boots as the command net erupted with overlapping reports. Drones blinded, patrols losing contact, static crawling through channels that had been clean hours ago. She didn't rush. Rushing wasted clarity. By the time she entered the TOC, the problem had teeth. Officers clustered around screens, hands chopping the air, words colliding. Eva absorbed it all in seconds. She saw what they couldn't yet articulate, the elegance of the jamming, how it hid inside civilian frequencies, how it adapted. Oracle wasn't just disrupting signals. He was teaching their systems bad habits. She stood back at first, listening. Watching Captain Hayes dismiss one option after another, watching frustration bloom into rigidity. She felt that familiar isolation, the sense of standing just outside the circle where decisions were made. It hurt more than she expected. She had hoped foolishly that the earlier incident might have softened something. It hadn't. When the feed finally resolved into a visual, her pulse ticked up. A man on a ledge, an antenna array blooming like a metallic flower against stone. Distance data scrolled across the screen. 6,000 meters. The room sagged under the number. Eva felt something settle inside her. Not excitement, acceptance. The pieces aligned with an almost cruel perfection. This was why she had built the system, why she had endured the sideways looks, the jokes, the isolation. She hadn't known the moment would look like this, but she had known it would come. She stepped forward. What does it cost to speak up when you already know the answer will sound impossible? Her voice cut cleanly through the noise, calm, precise. She didn't raise it, she didn't need to. I can make that shot. The disbelief was immediate and predictable. She absorbed it without flinching. She had learned not to take skepticism personally. Skepticism was often just fear wearing intelligence as a disguise. Captain Hayes reacted exactly as she expected. Regulations, records, ridicule. His words stung, not because they were sharp, but because they echoed the same refrain she'd heard her whole career. Stay in your lane. Don't complicate things. Don't be different. She ignored him and focused on the colonel. Colonel Vance didn't dismiss her outright. That was the difference. He studied her like a man measuring risk, not pride. She met his gaze and held it, feeling the old anxiety twist briefly in her stomach. This mattered, not for her reputation, but for lives she would never see. When he told her to explain, she did, stripped of drama, reduced to variables. She could feel the room shifting, not convinced but listening. It was enough. When the order came, get your gear, she felt a quiet release, not triumph, responsibility. Why does determination feel heavier than fear when there's no room left for error? The outcrop was colder than she expected. Wind scraped along the rock, testing edges. Eva anchored the tripod with deliberate care, every movement economical. Elia stood beside her, silent, observant. She appreciated that. Words were distractions right now. As the drones took position, data flowed in, painting the invisible terrain of air between her and the target. She adjusted, recalculated, cross-checked. Anxiety hovered at the edges, not about her math but about the chain of events that had nearly prevented this moment. She pushed it aside. There was no space for bitterness here. Behind her, she felt Hayes and Miller's presence like static. She didn't turn. She refused to let their doubt enter the equation. She chambered the round and settled in. Her breathing slowed. The world narrowed. In that narrowing, she felt something close to peace. This was where she was most herself, not proving, not defending, just executing a solution she trusted. When she announced the shot, her voice was steady. The recoil was familiar, grounding. Then came the weight. What does hope look like when it's stretched across 11 seconds of silence? Time elongated. Elia's counted without drama. Eva tracked the invisible arc in her mind, feeling every adjustment she had made as if she could touch the air itself. She didn't pray. She trusted. When the feed bloomed with dust and falling metal, the tension broke like a snapped wire. The jamming died. Voices surged. Relief crashed through the TOC in waves. Eva cycled the bolt and caught the casing, her hands steady. She felt proud then, but the pride was inward, almost private. A quiet acknowledgement, you did what you were built to do. She looked out across the valley, the mountains dark against the fading sky. Somewhere far away, a threat had ended not with a firefight but with understanding. Physics had won. Preparation had won. As they packed up, she felt something unfamiliar rise beneath the exhaustion. Hoping. Not the naive kind, the earned kind. The kind that whispered that maybe, slowly, imperfectly, systems could learn. Sometimes, resilience isn't loud. Sometimes it's patient enough to wait until the truth has nowhere left to hide. Why did the applause feel heavier than the silence ever had? The noise rolled over her in waves, cheers, disbelief, voices overlapping in excitement. But Eva Rostova stood apart from it, hands resting on the rifle case, breathing in the cold mountain air as if the sound might pass through her without leaving a mark. She had learned to distrust moments like this. Praise could be as fleeting as ridicule. Both depended on attention. And attention, she knew, always moved on. As they drove back through the gates of the base, headlights slicing through dust and darkness, soldiers stopped to stare. Some raised fists. Others simply watched, eyes wide, as if trying to reconcile the quiet woman they'd ignored with the impossible thing she'd just done. Eva kept her gaze forward. Pride tugged at her chest, but so did something else, unease. Victory changed things. It always did. And change made people unpredictable. She remembered another mission years ago when success had turned allies into auditors overnight. Questions sharpened. Motives were inspected. Exceptional outcomes invited scrutiny, not trust. She wondered distantly what shape the scrutiny would take this time. Inside, exhaustion finally surfaced, the kind that seeped into bone. She rested her head briefly against the seat, eyes closed, letting the hum of the engine steady her. She wasn't replaying the shot. She was replaying the moments before it, the disbelief, the dismissal, the narrow margin where everything could have ended differently. That was what stayed with her, not the triumph, the fragility of being allowed to try. What happens when the system realizes it almost failed because it refused to listen? Morning came too quickly. The parade ground baked under a pale sun, heat rising in visible waves. Eva stood at attention among the ranks, her posture precise, her expression neutral. She could feel eyes on her now, curious, respectful, uncertain. It was a strange reversal. Yesterday she'd been invisible. Today she was a lesson. Colonel Vance's voice carried easily, calm and deliberate. He spoke of facts, not feelings, dates, actions, consequences. As names were spoken, Eva felt a quiet tightening in her chest, Not satisfaction, not relief, but a sober recognition of cost. Accountability was necessary, but it was never clean. People fell. Reputations fractured. Systems corrected themselves by breaking something else first. When Miller's name was read, Eva didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She felt no victory there, only a dull sadness. He had chosen his path long before that moment in the maintenance bay. The consequences were simply catching up. When the counseling statement was rescinded publicly, something inside her loosened. Not because the mark was gone, but because the truth had been spoken aloud. Silence, when imposed, was suffocating. Silence, when chosen, was strength. This was the difference. Then came the salute. It struck her harder than the reprimands had, a colonel saluting her not as spectacle but as acknowledgement. She returned it automatically, training guiding her body while her mind raced to keep up. She felt exposed in a way she hadn't expected, seen, not as an anomaly, as a professional. As the formation broke, the base exhaled. Conversations erupted. Eva stepped away quietly, slipping back into the spaces she knew best. Why did quiet feel safer than recognition, even now? Back in her container, the familiar hum welcomed her. Tools, screens, order. She set the rifle on the bench and began to clean it, movements automatic, grounding. The new optic sat untouched, still sealed in its case. She didn't reject the gesture, but she wasn't ready to accept it either. Her system had proven itself. More than that, it had survived misunderstanding, sabotage, and doubt. It carried weight now, not just ballistic, but symbolic. As she worked, fragments of conversation drifted through her mind. Officers recalibrating their opinions. Soldiers retelling the shot with embellishments already creeping in. She resisted the urge to correct them. Stories evolved. Truth endured elsewhere. She thought of the younger soldiers watching from the edges. The ones who didn't fit neatly. The ones learning when to speak and when to stay silent. She hoped, quietly, that something in today's reckoning might widen the margins for them. The door slid open. Elias stepped in, carrying the oil-wrapped component. He didn't make a speech. He didn't smile. He simply placed the part on the bench. Eva understood immediately what it meant. Trust, peer recognition, the kind that mattered. "Thank you," she said, and meant more than the words could hold. After he left, she installed the new piece with care, feeling the system settle into an even truer alignment. Stronger, more resilient, like herself. What does redemption look like when it arrives without apology? Later, alone again, Eva opened her digital logbook. The official after-action report was already complete, dry, precise, sufficient. She stared at the cursor blinking beneath it, considering what to add. Her fingers hovered, then typed, then erased. She didn't want to mythologize the moment. She didn't want to diminish it either. She thought of the kick in the maintenance bay, the cracked glass, the order to stop, the long hours of rebuilding, the 11 seconds of flight, the salute. She typed 3 words. Correction was achieved. She sat back, letting the glow of the screen fade into the ambient light. Outside, the base continued its rhythms. New missions loaded. New problems emerged. Nothing had truly ended. Something had shifted. Eva closed the log and powered down the terminal. She rested a hand on the rifle case, not possessive, just present. This was her craft, her language, her way of contributing without asking for permission. She knew there would be other moments, other rooms where she would be doubted, other systems that resisted change. The world rarely transformed overnight, but it could be nudged, adjusted, calibrated. Sometimes redemption doesn't arrive as forgiveness. Sometimes it arrives as proof, quiet, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Why did the quiet after everything felt louder than the chaos before it? Eva noticed it on the 3rd night after the shot. The base had settled back into its routines, but something underneath had shifted, like ground that had been subtly re-leveled. Conversations stopped when she passed, not abruptly, not rudely, just enough to be noticed. Doors opened a little faster. Questions were phrased more carefully. Respect, she realized, didn't arrive with applause. It arrived with hesitation, with people reconsidering what they thought they knew. She didn't know how she felt about that. In her container, she worked longer hours than before, not because she was ordered to, but because stillness made her restless. She ran system checks that didn't strictly need running. She refined algorithms that were already within acceptable margins. Perfection wasn't the goal. Control was. After weeks of being at the mercy of other people's decisions, control felt like oxygen. At night, when the base generators dropped to their lower hum and the mountains became dark silhouettes against the stars, she sometimes replayed the moment just before she'd spoken in the TOC. That brief pause, the calculation not of wind or distance but of consequence. She wondered what would have happened if she'd stayed silent. The thought tightened something in her chest. Silence had protected her many times. That day, it would have failed everyone else. She slept lightly. Dreams came fragmented, glass cracking, numbers drifting out of reach, a voice saying unauthorized over and over until it lost meaning. What does vigilance look like when the danger is no longer external? The intelligence reports grew quieter after Oracle's fall, but Eva knew better than to equate silence with safety. Systems adapted. Enemies learned. She tracked subtle anomalies in the data, teaching junior analysts how to see patterns instead of spikes. Some listened. Some nodded politely and went back to old habits. Change was slow. It always was. One afternoon, a young specialist hovered at the edge of her workspace, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Finally, he spoke. "Staff Sergeant, how did you know, back then, that it was possible?" Eva considered the question longer than he expected. "I didn't," she said finally. "I knew how to find out." He frowned, processing. She softened her tone. "Confidence isn't about certainty. It's about preparation. You prepare so thoroughly that when uncertainty shows up, it has fewer places to hide." He nodded, eyes bright, and left. Eva watched him go, feeling something unfamiliar stir. Responsibility, perhaps, or the quiet weight of being an example she'd never asked to be. Why did leadership feel lonelier the moment she didn't have to fight for space anymore? Captain Hayes avoided her now, not openly, professionally, even, but with a distance that spoke volumes. Eva didn't resent him. She understood the fear that came with being publicly corrected. Institutions taught people to defend their authority at all costs. Admitting error felt like erosion. One evening, as she was locking up her container, Hayes stopped a few paces away. He cleared his throat. "Staff Sergeant." She turned, neutral, attentive. "I wanted to say," he began, then paused. The pause stretched. He exhaled. "What you did, it mattered." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't quite respect either. It was effort. Eva nodded once. "Yes, sir." He hesitated, then walked away. Eva watched him go, feeling neither vindicated nor disappointed, just aware. People grew at different speeds, some only when forced. Later that night, she climbed the small rise behind the motor pool, a place few people bothered with. From there, she could see the valley where the shot had flown, invisible now in darkness. The stars were sharp, unblinking. She felt small beneath them and strangely comforted. Precision, she thought, was just humility with discipline, knowing how little margin there really was. What happens when the myth starts to grow faster than the truth? By the end of the week, stories had already begun to mutate. 6 kilometers became 7. One shot became 3. Someone claimed she'd smiled after pulling the trigger. Eva corrected none of it. Myths were easier than nuance. Easier than explaining that the hardest part hadn't been the shot, it had been standing still while people decided whether she was worth listening to. A request came down from higher command. A formal write-up, expanded briefing, potential replication of her system. Committees formed. Questions multiplied. Eva answered them patiently, though each meeting drained her more than the mission had. She watched as ideas were simplified, edges rounded off to fit procurement language. Capability translated into bullet points. She felt protective, not of credit but of integrity. Some things lost effectiveness when stripped of context. Her system wasn't just hardware, it was process, discipline, and understanding that tools were only as honest as the hands that built and used them. During one briefing, a senior officer asked, "So this replaces the need for conventional assets?" Eva shook her head. "No, sir, it fills a gap like everything else. It fails if you ask it to be something it is." The officer smiled thinly, already half distracted. Eva recognized the look. Solutions were attractive, limits were inconvenient. Why did recognition feel like another kind of test? That evening she returned to her container and sat without turning anything on. No screens, no data, just the hum of the servers and her own breathing. She felt tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. Proud, yes, but also wary. She had seen how quickly institutions consumed what they admired. She thought of the emblem on her toolkit, the phoenix rising through static, rebirth through interference. She had chosen it years ago without fully understanding why. Now she did. Survival wasn't about burning brightly. It was about transmitting clearly through noise. A message pinged softly on her pad. A new mission file, different region, different problem, familiar complexity. She felt a small, steady spark of anticipation. This, at least, made sense. She stood and began to prepare. Not hurried, not dramatic, just methodical, the way she always did. Sometimes, after the impossible becomes real, the hardest work is learning how to live in the space it leaves behind. Why did the next mission feel heavier than the one that nearly broke the record? The file loaded slowly, line by line, as if it understood the weight it carried. Eva watched the progress bar creep forward and felt a familiar tightening in her shoulders. New region, new terrain, different enemy. But the same underlying truth pulsed beneath the data. Once you proved something was possible, you were expected to repeat it cleanly, reliably, without friction. The impossible, once done, became a standard, and standards, she knew, were unforgiving. She read in silence, absorbing the details. The threat wasn't as dramatic as Oracle. No single mastermind perched on a cliff. This was subtler, distributed, a network that adapted by dissolving and reforming, harder to see, harder to end, the kind of problem that punished impatience. She felt determined, but not eager. Outside, the base had resumed its rhythms, but she sensed a shift in how those rhythms touched her. People deferred now. They asked instead of assuming. It should have felt validating. Instead, it made her careful. Attention created gravity. Gravity distorted things. She packed deliberately, choosing tools with the same care she chose words. The rifle went into its case last. She rested her hand on it for a moment longer than necessary. Not sentiment, habit, grounding. As she worked, she became aware of something else creeping in, a quiet fear she hadn't felt before. Not of failure, of expectation. Failure she could survive. Expectation had a way of eroding margins until there was nowhere left to stand. What happens when people stop questioning you and start assuming you're infallible? The briefing was smaller this time, fewer voices, more trust. Eva stood at the edge of the table, listening as the plan unfolded. She noted the assumptions being made in her direction. Eva will handle the long-range interdiction. Eva can confirm the atmospheric model. Eva's system should be sufficient. She cleared her throat gently. The room paused. "Should," she said calmly, "isn't a plan, it's a hope." A few heads turned. No irritation, just surprise. She continued, choosing her words carefully. "This environment is different. We need redundancies. And we need to accept that my system may not be the right answer at every phase." There was a moment of silence. Then the colonel nodded slowly. "Fair." Eva felt a small release. Not because she'd been heard, but because she'd pushed back before the narrative hardened. She had learned that the most dangerous myths were the ones people told about competence. They erased context. They erased humanity. After the briefing, Elias caught up to her in the corridor. "You're recalibrating them," he said quietly. She glanced at him. "I'm trying to." He nodded once. "Good." Why did admitting limits feel braver than claiming strength? They deployed before dawn. The landscape changed quickly, flat scrub giving way to jagged rises, the air thinner, sharper. Eva set up in a temporary position carved into stone, the wind tugging at her sleeves. She felt the familiar focus settle in, but beneath it ran a new undercurrent, awareness. She wasn't alone in this anymore, not truly. Eyes were on her, even from afar. She ran the models, adjusted, paused. Something didn't sit right. The data was clean, too clean. She frowned, running the numbers again. Still clean. No turbulence where there should have been variability. No noise. It was tempting to accept it, to move forward. But experience whispered caution. Nature was rarely that cooperative. She flagged the anomaly and waited. Minutes stretched. The team grew restless. Time mattered. The target window narrowed. She felt the pressure build, subtle but insistent. This was the moment myths were born, when someone pushed through doubt to meet expectation. Instead, she stopped. "Hold," she said into the mic. Her voice was steady, but her pulse ticked faster. There was a pause. "Reason," came the reply. "I don't trust the data," she said simply. "Yet." Silence, then begrudging acceptance. "Acknowledged." She leaned back slightly, exhaling. Her hands trembled just a fraction, not from fear but from the effort of resisting momentum. This, she realized, was a different kind of courage. Not action, but restraint. What does trust look like when it means waiting instead of acting? The anomaly revealed itself 10 minutes later. A thermal shift masked by the terrain, invisible until the sun climbed just enough to disturb the air. Had she fired earlier, the shot would have drifted wide. Not catastrophically, just enough to fail. Eva felt a quiet satisfaction, not triumph but confirmation. Doubt, when honored, had done its job. The mission adjusted. Another asset took the lead. Her role shifted to support. She accepted it without resistance. This wasn't about being central, it was about being accurate. As they packed up hours later, exhaustion settled over her like a heavy blanket. The mission hadn't made headlines. No records were broken. No salutes exchanged. And yet, she felt something deeper than pride. She had protected the truth, from simplification, from haste, from herself. Why did the smaller victories feel harder to explain? Back at base, the debrief was efficient, professional, a few nods of approval. Eva spoke when needed, then fell quiet. She noticed the absence of tension she'd carried before, not relief, but balance. She hadn't been tested against the impossible this time. She'd been tested against herself. Later, alone in her container, she cleaned the rifle again. Same ritual, same care. The system hadn't fired a shot today, but it had done its work all the same. She logged the mission with the same precision as before, noting the anomaly, the delay, the outcome. She paused at the end, fingers hovering. She didn't write "correction was achieved." Instead, she typed, "judgment was exercised." It felt right. She leaned back, letting the chair creak softly beneath her weight. Fatigue seeped in now that the vigilance had eased. She welcomed it. Fatigue meant she'd held the line. Outside, the base lights flickered on as dusk settled. Somewhere, a radio played faintly. Life went on. Eva closed her eyes briefly, thinking of the younger specialist who'd asked her how she knew. She wondered what he would learn from this mission. That restraint mattered. That saying no could be as valuable as saying yes. Sometimes, strength isn't measured by how far you can reach, but by how well you know when not to. Why did the quiet after the last mission feel like a question she still hadn't answered? Eva Rostova noticed it the morning she woke without urgency. No alarms. No pending briefings stacked like weights on her chest. The base moved outside her container with its usual mechanical rhythm, but for the first time in weeks, nothing pulled at her attention. The stillness felt unfamiliar, almost intrusive. She sat on the edge of her bunk, boots unlaced, hands resting loosely on her knees, and listened to her own breathing. It struck her then that she didn't know what came next, not tactically but personally. Missions were easy that way. They told you where to stand. Life afterward did not. She stood and went through her routine anyway. Order mattered even when direction didn't. She cleaned her workspace, aligned tools she had aligned 100 times before, checked systems that were already green. Not because they needed it, but because repetition anchored her. Outside, the sun climbed slowly over the ridgeline, washing the base in pale gold. It looked almost peaceful, almost undeserved. She thought about the arc she'd traveled without ever intending to. From being ignored to being doubted to being watched. None of it had been the goal. She had only wanted to do the work well. Somewhere along the way, that had become remarkable instead of expected. The realization left a faint bitterness behind. Excellence shouldn't feel like rebellion. Yet here she was. What happens when the fight shifts from proving yourself to deciding who you are without the fight? The request came mid-morning, not an order, an invitation. Colonel Vance wanted to see her, alone. Eva felt a brief tightening in her stomach, an old reflex. Authority meetings rarely arrived without consequence. Still, she went. The colonel's office was spare, functional. He gestured for her to sit, then surprised her by speaking plainly. No preamble, no ceremony. He talked about the record she'd set, the missions that followed, the way her judgment had altered how decisions were being made at the command level. He spoke of opportunity, training roles, advisory positions, influence. Eva listened carefully, weighing each word. Influence sounded flattering. It also sounded dangerous. Visibility had a cost. She had spent years operating in the margins because the margins allowed honesty. She wasn't sure she wanted to trade that for a seat at a table where compromise often wore the mask of consensus. When he finished, he waited. "I'm not finished in the field," she said finally, choosing truth over polish. "But I'm willing to teach when it matters." Vance studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "That's a rare answer," he said. "We'll make room for it." As she left, Eva felt something settle, not relief, not pride, but alignment. She hadn't said yes out of obligation. She hadn't said no out of fear. She had chosen deliberately. That felt like progress. Why did choosing herself feel like the hardest calculation yet? In the days that followed, she began to notice subtler changes. Younger analysts sought her out not for stories but for guidance. She didn't give speeches, she asked questions. She made them explain their reasoning, then showed them where the gaps hid. Some bristled, some leaned in. The ones who leaned in stayed. One afternoon, the same young specialist from weeks earlier returned, carrying a pad full of scribbles. He pointed out a pattern she hadn't noticed yet. It wasn't revolutionary, but it was correct. Eva felt a quiet warmth bloom in her chest. This was continuity. This was how knowledge survived ego. She corrected him gently where he was wrong and told him why. When he left, more confident than when he arrived, she understood something she hadn't before. Legacy wasn't built in records or salutes. It lived in transfer, in clarity passed hand to hand. That night she took the long way back to her container, walking past the maintenance bay. The concrete floor looked the same. The air smelled the same. But the memory no longer had teeth. It had weight, but not pain. She stood there for a moment, hands in her pockets, acknowledging what had been without letting it define what remained. Why did forgiveness feel unnecessary once understanding arrived? Her final entry in the deployment log came later that week, not because the tour had ended, but because something internal had closed its loop. She read through the previous notes, technical, sparse, accurate, a record of problems solved and lessons learned. She added one more line, not operational, not for anyone else. Identity reconciled. She closed the file and powered down the terminal. The hum faded to a background presence, no longer demanding. She sat back and let herself feel tired, not the sharp fatigue of vigilance, but the deep, earned weariness of someone who had held steady through pressure and come out intact. Outside, the night air cooled the ground. The mountains loomed indifferent and ancient. Eva stepped out and looked up at the stars. They reminded her of trajectories, of how small adjustments early could change where something landed far away. People were like that, she thought. So were institutions. So was she. She didn't know where the next mission would take her. She didn't need to. She trusted the process now, not the bureaucracy, but the discipline, the quiet work, the patience to wait, the courage to speak when silence would cost more. She turned back toward the light of her container, ready to continue, not as a symbol, not as an exception, but as herself. Sometimes, strength isn't proven by distance or force or records broken. Sometimes, dignity doesn't speak at all. It simply acts and lets the truth carry the rest of the way.